look, it's terrific to be here at the Garma Festival. This is my first Garma Festival, but as I said to Galleroy Yunupingu, if he is willing, I would like the first week that I spend in a remote Indigenous community as Prime Minister, should that happen, to be here in this very significant Indigenous community. The Yolngu people, their stories have been emblematic of the struggles of remote Indigenous peoples over the last couple of generations, and I think it would be a very instructive thing for a Prime Minister and senior officials of the government to spend a week here to learn what it is like to live, to train, to study in this area. I'm really pleased to be here with not only Nigel Scullion, the Shadow Minister, but also with my friend Warren Mundine. Warren and I are from different political traditions, but we've known each other for a long time. We've been mates for a long time, and we're of like mind when it comes to most Indigenous issues. And I am convinced that Indigenous policy and administration will be so much better if it is closely informed by the real lived experience of Indigenous people. That's why I believe I couldn't pick a better person in terms of his life story and in terms of his experience and involvement in public policy to be the chairman of my Indigenous Council. So I'm really pleased to be here with Warren. I think he has a great contribution to make to the life of our nation and to better policy for Indigenous Australians and for all Australians. And Warren, you might like to say a few words about it.
Yeah, I suppose it's a bit of a surprise to a lot of people to think about this, but as Tony said, we have been discussing these things for Indigenous affairs for a number of years, and we have come to a very like-minded approach to it. And I just want to echo the words of Galleroy Yunupingu in regard to waking up land rights. And it's so important for us to wake up land rights. It is our soul, it is our economic future, it is the way our children and everything needs to move forward. And this is what we'll be looking about, how we can open up and wake up land rights so it becomes that, creates that economic and commercial future for Indigenous generations in the future and in the present, and looking at the way we can get schools, safe communities and moving ahead. Thank you.
Okay, now I'm going to take a few questions on Indigenous issues and then I might allow Warren to absent himself from the general political questions if there are any. So look, are there any Indigenous issues? And we'll go around
the circle and everyone get a chance, starting with you, Lenny.
How soon would you make changes to land rights? How soon would you open it up? Would it happen within 6 months, a month? How long?
Well, I don't want to be too prescriptive now, and I don't want to store up trouble and dissension by going off half-cocked here. I think it's pretty clear that we need to try to ensure that Indigenous land is an economic asset and not simply a spiritual and cultural asset. And that's what I will be working towards bringing about. Now, there'll be all sorts of different ideas as to how that's to be done, and it may well be that in some areas it will be one way forward, in other areas it might be a different way forward, but I absolutely accept, because we heard it today from Galleroy, I've heard it over many years now from Noel Pearson in Cape York. Indigenous people have a spiritual connection to land, a very heartfelt, soul-felt, spiritual connection with land. But that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be used economically, and I want to ensure that that can happen more readily in the future than in the past.
Mr. Abbott, sorry, can I just put this to you actually? Could you explain what it is that made you disillusioned with Labor on Indigenous policy, and how you expect to represent such a diverse cultures in the Indigenous landscape in Australia?
Well, I wouldn't put it in disillusion with Labor policy. Look, I got a lot of respect, and as people know in the public record, I've a lot of praise for Jenny Macklin as Minister for Indigenous Affairs. You know, she brought out the Closing the Gap, and for the first time we've had measurable outcomes, we had time frames and we had targets for that to happen. The issues, I suppose, in regard to that is like we seem to be moving at a marathon pace to meet those gaps, while at the same time we seem to be sprinting with a number of other issues like incarceration rates of Indigenous kids, the problems that we're having within our communities, getting the kids to school and that. Through the conversations with Tony and Nigel and that, I've come to the conclusion that we need to really quicken this pace up. And the Indigenous people out there, you know, you heard the words of Galarrwuy Yunupingu today, are crying out for this. They want this awakening, they want government to play a role for this, and they want the empowerment of their communities to move forward.
Lisa, we'll go around the circle, but Lisa?
Mr. Abbott, some Yolngu people have been highly critical of the anti-intervention and the Stronger Futures package that has followed under Labor. Can we expect an overhaul of those policies under a Abbott-led government?
Those policies have already changed very significantly from the early days of the implementation of the intervention. And look, I was a strong supporter of the intervention, as you'd expect. Did I say that everything happened perfectly? Of course it didn't. It was an emergency. And when you are responding to an emergency, inevitably it tends to be a bit of a blunt instrument. Over time you refine it, and all credit to the current government for, in many ways, quite effectively refining it. Yep, let's be going around the... Yes, Mel?
Closing the gap statements, Labor has announced that it would have 3 new targets. Dean has said that it's been a good program in getting targets in place. Would you support the 3 new targets that the government would like to...
Well, I'm happy to look at that. I've only had a chance to read Jenny Macklin's speech on the way over in the plane, and look, I'd like to carefully consider it, but in principle I'm happy with that. But can I say that if we are going to empower communities, we've got to empower individuals, and we will never have empowered individuals unless the kids go to school, the adults go to work, and the ordinary law of the land runs in the places where they live. So these are the tests that I would like any future coalition government to pass much better than is currently the case. We know that here in the Northern Territory, even on the official figures, only about 60% of Indigenous kids are going to school in the remote areas. Completely unacceptable, absolutely completely unacceptable. We know because all of the senior leaders here lament it, that there's effectively been a lost generation of kids that didn't go to school, are not really literate, and it's very hard to be a full participant in modern Australia if you haven't had a reasonable education in English. Now, I'm all with Noel, who at Arakoon and elsewhere has, if you like, extended the school program to include important elements of Indigenous culture. I mean, the only place where Indigenous culture exists is here in Australia. So I think it is important that our systems, our official systems, acknowledge it, recognise it, foster it, keep it alive. But it all starts with a good education. Look, I had a brief discussion with Noel in Melbourne a week or so back over this. I've had a chance to look at the initial document, the initial Jarwin document, if you like. I think there's a lot of merit in looking at better forms of governance. I've spent, as you know, a fair bit of time in Cape York, and the Family Responsibilities Commission model, where you've got, in that case, a distinguished magistrate, David Glasgow, advised by local commissioners when it comes to making decisions about people's welfare entitlements. I think that model has a lot to recommend it, and I think it's good that other communities, including people in this area, are trying to look at more effective ways of governance. So I'm happy to work with Noel to try to bring this about, but I think this is a work in progress, and let's take the work forward.
Which agencies do you think should be cut?
Look, I think we're all getting ahead of ourselves in regard to this area. There's a couple of things we need to focus on first. There is an election. There's an announcement today about my position, which could be a position or couldn't be a position, depending
on whether we win or I win.
The election result.
Right, yeah.
And of course, this is the review process, so we need to go for a review process now. What I've got to say is that you're looking at people are jumping up and down, think they're getting a bit excited about this. The actual thing is about how we look at this, how we see what works, what doesn't work, and then we start focusing on how we can do better in these areas and start improving on it. And the Indigenous communities are really crying out for it. And also, how do we devolve the power back to those communities rather than trying to run it from Canberra or from other areas?
Mr. Mundine, can I ask a question about what sort of resources you want this council to be able to access, and also is your decision to accept this position in principle your endorsement of Mr. Abbott for the Prime Ministership?
Look, let's not jump too far into these areas. Look, there's no doubt about it. The first time I started working with Tony Abbott was on. You only have to look back through my career. I've worked on the National Indigenous Council with the Howard government at the time. I worked with the Rudd government in regard to the Indigenous Housing Advisory Council, and I've worked. In fact, I was only talking to Minister Macklin today about some, looking at the area of jobs and moving forward in that stuff. Now, look, I'm not going to hide the fact that through the conversations I've had with Tony Abbott since 2008, very deep conversations about this area and about Australia, because this is an Australian issue. We have become friends, and I do enjoy and wish him all the best for that election.
Tony,
Thanks, mate.
Who
Look,
are the senior women involved in the consultation process?
Okay, well, it was good to see Marcia Langton here, and I think Marcia had quite an input into the Jarwin process that Noel was talking about here yesterday, as you'd expect, because not only is Marcia Langton a very distinguished Indigenous person, but she's a very distinguished academic. So I have to win an election, and if the election is won, if the election is won, then in consultation with Warren, there'll be other members of the council, and the intention is to ensure that we get a reasonable spread of urban and bush and regional, of male and female. And look, my only real requirement is that they want to make a difference. They want to make a difference, and while being passionately committed to Indigenous Australians, they want every Australian to advance together. That's what I want.
You've also called for gas to go to keep the refinery viable.
Okay, now look, let's deal with all Indigenous issues. Yeah.
Can I just ask about talking about moving towards self-development?
Yeah.
Will you be leaning on Queensland to repeal the Wild Rivers legislation as soon as possible, but also leaning on Queensland and the Northern Territory to put back in place the alcohol restrictions, which Warren Mundine today is described as one of the biggest challenges, and also, just secondly, politicians, prime ministers, opposition leaders, ministers have come to the top end for decades, making visionary speeches, perhaps like the one you have today. What makes you think that you can change what those before you haven't?
Do I think that the world is changed by a speech? No, I don't. Do I think that individuals can be touched and moved and changed by a speech? Yes, I do. And in the end, the world is a product of all of the people doing the best they can to make it better. So we do make a difference. And over time, if you look back, there have been enormous differences and enormous improvements made. There is still a long, long way to go. And our job in this generation is to do our bit to make our part of the journey better than would otherwise be the case. Wild Rivers, yes. Look, my intention is to work constructively and cooperatively with my state and territory colleagues, but my strong disposition is we have to allow economic development, and legislation which is an obstacle to that should be removed or amended. And we have to allow communities to be safe from the scourge of alcohol if that's their choice. And this idea that alcohol should be forced on communities to the extent that anyone has it, I think is just dead wrong.
Mr. Abbott, on economic development, you say you admit that Aboriginal needs to become an economic asset. Can you give us an idea of exactly what you mean, or the kinds of things you mean? Because it's a very broad statement.
Okay, well, to take Cape York, for instance, the Wild Rivers legislation put in place by the BT Bligh government basically adds a whole new level of bureaucracy to any economic activity within 1 kilometre of a watercourse. Now, that's basically the whole of Cape York. I mean, there's hardly any land in Cape York that is not within 1 kilometre of a watercourse, and it just means that it is vastly harder to get anything done, whether it's a cattle station, whether it's a tourist lodge, let alone a mine or anything like that. And cattle stations, tourist lodges and mines are all critical if Indigenous people are to have real jobs. And there is no incompatibility with being a full Aboriginal person, a full person of culture, if I might use that phrase, and being a full participant in the economy of modern Australia. Look, I think you know what I'm driving at. There is no inconsistency. There is no inconsistency with being with Aboriginal people preserving their sense of self, preserving their identity, and fully participating in the economy of modern Australia.
Would you get this repealing of these laws in train, within the first year? And is there any mechanism by where the federal government could override the states?
Well, my understanding is that Campbell Newman wants to amend or repeal the Wild Rivers legislation to the extent necessary to allow economic development to go ahead. Now, I know Campbell very well. I work with him very well together. I know that Noel Pearson and Campbell have worked very well together in the past, and I have no reason to think that they can't continue to work well together.
Mr. Abbott, the polls. How can you describe over in the territory, you're under the federal government, over there we're under the Commonwealth government. How you define the match up?
Okay, well look, federal government and Commonwealth government tend to be interchangeable terms. Frankly, I prefer Commonwealth government, but over the last generation or so, a lot of people have started using the term federal government. But what I'm talking about is the government in Canberra, and I want the government in Canberra to be better informed about Indigenous issues so that the decisions that it makes, insofar as they impact on Indigenous people, are better decisions. Because white fellas sitting down in Parliament House can make a lot of mistakes when they suddenly dream up something that they think is going to be good for people living in places like Nhulunbuy and elsewhere. John? Now look, okay, have we finished on Indigenous stuff? One more? Yep. Yep.
Mr. Abbott, you're talking about a focus on sending children to predominantly Western schools and working in a predominantly Western workforce, and a focus on policing in a Western system. How do you differentiate that from an assimilationist policy?
Well, I'm going to ask Warren to add to this, but look, you know, culture can never justify gratuitous violence against vulnerable people, and that's why I think it's absolutely critical that we have proper policing wherever Australians live, including where Indigenous Australians live. Now I want Aboriginal people to be educated in their culture. Sometimes that will be by their parents and their grandparents and their kinspeople, but to some extent that can be in schools, and that's why I'm so strongly in favour of what Noel is doing in Aurukun and elsewhere, where after the kids have done their normal school day, they stay back for a couple of hours with the local elders to talk about their own traditions. There is no incompatibility with a good education in English and a full enculturation in the traditional things. There is no incompatibility whatsoever. I think a better education in English, I think, is going to help the preservation of the high cultures of Aboriginal people.
Yeah, just in regard to the jobs, we need to get some nonsense out of this debate, quite frankly. Aboriginal people have been drovers, shearers, for the last 200 years. They've been working on farms, they've been going out and getting their kids educated, they've been feeding their families, they've been looking after their families and moving forward. And this idea that this is a Western thing, I think is quite bizarre. Africans have been doing it for thousands of years. Chinese have been doing it for thousands of years. And we all live in the 21st century these days. So work and getting a job, feeding your families, and that is not a particular Western thing. It is a thing across all cultures and across all societies.
Can I just ask on the senior bureaucrats coming up to Indigenous communities, how often do you envisage that will take place, and how many bureaucrats are we talking about relocating for parts of the year?
Okay, well look, my expectation is that the Prime Minister's Indigenous Council would meet at least 3 times a year, and that the chairman, Warren, would meet with me and with Nigel once a month or more often if necessary. My expectation is that I will spend a week, just a week, but a week in a Indigenous community, and I would expect that a number of senior officials, starting with the Secretary of the Department of PM and Prime Minister and Cabinet, would come along for it, as well as other officials who are relevant to the issues that are confronting that particular community. So you might have the Secretary of Health, you might have the Secretary of Education, you might have the Secretary of Resources, and in the modern world it ought to be possible for these people to work out of a remote location while at the same time becoming, at least to some extent, immersed in the life of the people who are living there, and that's got to be a good thing. I mean, everyone here at Garma for a few days is going to leave this place with a better grip on Indigenous issues, on Indigenous culture, and why should it only be people who are maybe students, you know, or people going on holiday who are able to experience something like this.
Mr. Abbott, the polls show that some of Kevin Rudd's appeal is starting to wear off.
Okay, now, have we got any more on Indigenous? Amos?
Yeah. Can you just explain in practical terms how West Toners and other governments, the voices of traditional people in remote places with poor language skills would be incorporated, will be heard in Canberra, and how they will be incorporated into politics?
Well, I don't say that is always easy, but that's one of the reasons why it's important to travel to the places where those people live and to be amongst them for significant periods of time, because that way you tend to get it in a way that you almost certainly don't from simply reading policy papers and listening to briefings from public servants.
Mr. Abbott, people in those communities do want to see traditional law recognised in particular.
Yeah.
Are you open to a conversation?
Look, I'm perfectly happy to see a traditional law acknowledged and lived by, provided it doesn't violate any of the basic norms of Australian society. For instance, women have to be respected. Violence against the vulnerable can never be condoned.
Mr. Abbott, you've talked about wanting to increase economic development, particularly mining.
Yeah.
In WA, there's Aboriginal communities right beside mines, and there's fly-in, fly-out workers that come in.
Yeah.
Do you support potentially having quotas on jobs for Indigenous people in those local communities right next to the mines?
Okay, well, Warren might want to add something here too because of his involvement with Generation 1, but I know the people from BHP, the people from Rio, I know Twiggy Forest very well, and look, there isn't a mining company today that isn't very eager for economic and for social reasons to try to get as many local Indigenous people as possible, as many Indigenous people more generally into their workforce. What we've got to try to do is to ensure that the education system and the local mindset is such that as many of them as is possible are able to take the jobs that are available.
And and Tony's just hit the nail on the head. The issue is that the mining companies, look, let's be quite honest about it. The mining companies were dragged to the table kicking and screaming in the earlier days. They're now taken up as a business case. In fact, I meet mining companies every week, And you see from large companies like the FMGs, the BHP Billitons and so on of the world, right down to the middle mining companies and the smaller mining companies have all been involved in looking about getting Indigenous people into jobs there. In fact, if you look at the statistics, there's more, on a statistical base, they've got about 5% to 9% of Indigenous people in mines. You see actually up to sometimes 26% of people working in those mines are Aboriginal. You're also seeing now Aboriginals going into mining themselves and into the contracting area. But the biggest issue that we got, and as that come out of the Generation 1 process, we've got 60,000 jobs committed for Indigenous people. The issue has been about the capacity and the education standards that we need to get in. So the problems we have is historical problems, not getting kids to schools, not getting education standards up to place, the social issues within Aboriginal communities, alcohol, the drugs and so on, and also the crime that's happening in that. So we need to break through those barriers to get the capacity up, because the jobs are there. Companies want it to happen. I haven't met a CEO or a chairman in Australia and globally who don't want to do something for Australian Indigenous people. We're going to move on other issues.
Oh, really? Okay, yeah, thanks, Warren. Thanks so much, mate. Well said.
And I'm very glad to exit left in regard to some of these political stuff.
All right, mate, good on you.
Mr. Abbott, do you think Kevin Rudd should disendorse the local candidate for Hotham, Jeff Lake, after it was revealed he made horrible comments to a lady in a wheelchair?
Look, obviously I absolutely deplore discourtesy to anyone. I particularly deplore discourtesy towards vulnerable people. Mr Rudd's standards are a matter for Mr Rudd. What this does seem to indicate, though, is there are ongoing factional fights, ongoing factional bitterness, division and dysfunction inside the Labor Party.
Mr Abbott, do you intend to abide by the...
Kevin Rudd's appeal seems to be wearing off. Surely you're not happy about that?
Look, I've said that winning an election from opposition is like climbing Mount Everest. I'm going to leave others to obsess about those polls. I'm just going to keep doing what I've been doing every day since becoming Leader of the Opposition, and certainly every day since this campaign started, focusing on how to reduce the Australian people's cost of living pressures and focusing on how to improve people's job security. I'm going to focus on the things that matter to the Australian people, and I'll let others obsess about insider political gossip and nonsense.
Mr Abbott, can you intend to abide by the budget honesty this election?
Look, we will give people in good time before polling day full information on what we're going to spend and what we're going to save, and the overall budgetary position will be stronger under the coalition than under the ALP. And I know Mr Rudd is hyperventilating about this whenever he gets a second, but we're not going to cop lectures on budget discipline or budget honesty from a government that hasn't been able to get any of its budget figures right, and which has given us the 5 biggest budget deficits in Australia's history.
Will you respond to local calls for gas to go? Because that's a lot of local jobs.
Absolutely appreciate that there's probably 2,000 local jobs that are directly dependent upon the continuation of the various alumina and aluminium plants in this area. Look, Ian Macfarlane has dealt with this on his visit here just a week or so back. Gary Gray and Ian Macfarlane are essentially on a unity ticket here. We want to ensure an ongoing supply of fuel for the plant. We're happy to look at the feasibility of a pipeline. What we would like from Rio, though, is a commitment to keep the plant going.
Mr Abbott, last election you found out your costings from an independent accounting firm that was later fined for misconduct. Are you going to get an independent firm to do them again, or will you get the Treasury and Finance Department?
Well, the vast majority of our costings will be done by the Parliamentary Budget Office. We submitted, from memory, some 200 policies to the Parliamentary Budget Office, and that's going to be the source and validation for the vast majority of the figures that we put forward. Those that haven't been validated by the Parliamentary Budget Office, we will have a process, an independent process of validation, and I don't think anyone will be in any doubt as to the credibility of our figures. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thanks.
Hi.
Hi, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
How are you?